Hey everybody, it's Matt. Thought I would do another video tonight. Wanted to do a review of a book that I got a couple of weeks ago. This is My Kid Brother's Band, also known as the Beatles, by Louise Harrison, who is George's older sister. He also has two older brothers. And so I read this. I've got a couple other books by Beatles siblings. One. There's a book by Julia Baird, who is John Lennon's sister. His mother got remarried and had two daughters. That book was not all that great, not all that informative. It's okay, but nothing special. I have the book by Patty Harrison or Patty Boyd, came out a few years ago, which was also nothing all that special, which was kind of a shame. I've had a huge crush on Patty Boyd probably my whole life, but so now here comes George's sister, who has actually through the years been pretty active on speaking at Beatle conventions and so forth, and she even did an album in the 60s, which was an interview album that I used to have, no longer do, where she talked about the Beatles that came out, I want to say 64, 65 or so. And so now her book here, and she is the oldest of the four Harrison siblings. She's about 12 years older than George, and the other brother is, I want to say, 9 or 10 years older, and then the second brother is 3 years older. Um, this book is a little bit better maybe than the Patty book or the book by Lennon's sister, but it's still got some problems, and it's not as good as I was hoping it would be. We'll just put it that way. So the the main problem, well, there's several problems really. The writing is terrible. Whoever edited this book really doesn't need to be an editor, or maybe it wasn't edited. I don't know, but the every page has at least 4 or 5 sentences that end in exclamation points. That the Beatles were on their way, and my brother came to visit me, and and you don't use exclamation points unless you're writing ad copy or you're writing, I don't know, a Bozo the Clown script or something. 99% of the time they're just overkill, which probably most people wouldn't care about, but, I write for a newspaper and I have to proofread stuff, and so that's sort of the other thing that's even more bothersome than the exclamation points throughout the book, through practically every page, is that she repeats herself quite a few times, and she'll say something and then she'll say it again 2 paragraphs later, and a paragraph or two later she'll say it a third time. It's just a couple of examples. She talks about the Gone Tropo album of George's, that that album was just out, and then paragraph later she says because the album was just out, and then says it a third time. uh, Another point in the book, she talks about her swimming pool that had a cover on it, and she mentions that 3 or 4 times on one page. As I don't really care what her swimming pool is like. Those are just two examples, but it's just all throughout the book. So it's really bad writing. It's badly edited, and the other problem is she goes off on tangents with no warning whatsoever onto totally unrelated topics. A lot of political views, a lot of projects that she worked on throughout her life that have nothing to do with the Beatles, which is, I don't have any problem with her having her views on things. I don't have any problem with her wanting to talk about her projects. Some of her political views I even agree with. It's jarring when you're reading her narrative about George and the Beatles, and then suddenly in the next paragraph she just switches gears and starts talking about ecology or whatever, or corporate takeover of America, which again, it's fine for her to have her opinion on those things, but probably she should have written another book. and covered that stuff. I know why she, included it in this book, because if she wrote another book about that stuff, it probably wouldn't sell very well. Uh, but nonetheless, I mean, 99% of, well, probably 100% of the people picking this book up are going to pick it up because she's George's sister, and they want to get her take on, someone that was that close to George and the Beatles. And they really don't, or at least I really don't want to read about her political opinions and views and her projects on buying some land to try to make a self-sustaining community, which is all well and good, but we're coming here to read about George and the Beatles, and there is some stuff about that in here, obviously, but it's just you know kind of bothersome to go off on these other topics. So there's that. As far as the rest of it, there is some um, value in that talks about the early life of how her parents met, and when it was just her and her brother, and then the two brothers, and then George came along. The drawback is her being 12 years older than George. She went to a boarding school, probably trying to figure out the timeline, but probably about the time he was 6 or 7 or so. And then she met a guy, got married, and went to, I think, Scotland and then to America. So she was not really present for much of his formative years, as far as when he decided to pick up a guitar and got interested in music and started playing in bands and got in the Beatles. She actually didn't meet the other three Beatles until they came to America in 1964 for the Ed Sullivan Show and the Washington, D.C. concert. George did go to America to visit her in 1963, a few months before the Beatles came over. And from reading this, that was the first time she'd seen him in probably a good 10 years or so. But yeah, so it's scant on new information and scant on details. There is some fun little nuggets in here. There's a neat little story about George being about 3 years old and his next older brother being 6, and them playing with their toys, and a funny little thing that George says. I won't say any more than that in case you want to read the book. It's kind of a neat little story that I hadn't heard before. Uh, she doesn't talk really too much about the other Beatles. Paul and Ringo get some mentions here and there. John gets very few. She's no fan of Yoko's, which she makes clear in a couple of comments in the book here. And she doesn't talk that much about the music, other than she tried to call and get the Beatles played on some of the radio stations and stuff in late '63, before they really broke big in America, when they were still had their records put out on Tolly and VJ and Swan, and kind of was riding back and forth with Brian Epstein and Dick James and George Martin to try to see how she could help promote the Beatles in America. That stuff's a little interesting. Some of the stuff, how their parents met and so forth, is pretty interesting. But past that early stuff, there's really no mention of what she thought of, Revolver, Sergeant Pepper, any of the Beatles music too much. I mean, she seems that she liked it, but she doesn't really talk about much of it. Doesn't mention John very often. She mentions Patty here and there. She never really mentions Olivia or Danny Harrison. I think they're mentioned maybe once or twice in the whole book. Kind of get the feeling that she and they aren't the best of friends or don't get along, even though she doesn't come out and say that. You kind of get the feeling that her and George, even though she denies it throughout the book, were not really all that close later in life. And so there's a lot of things like that are just sort of, you wish for more detail and you don't really get it, and you wish for more information that hadn't previously been known, and there's not a whole lot in there. There are a few, like I said, little anecdotes and nuggets here and there, but not a lot. And then there's just some obvious stuff. She talks about, you know, Penny Lane is a real street and Strawberry Fields is actually a real place, which, you know, anybody, even I think casual Beatle fans, have known that since 1967 or so. So, yeah, there's just really not a lot of. There is a. I did know that George had gone to America in '63 to visit his sister. I remember him reading about him going to a drive-in movie theater and going back and telling the Beatles that he didn't know if how much of a chance they had of making it in America, how much America would be interested in the Beatles, even though they were huge in England and parts of Europe by that time already. But one thing I didn't know, she talks about a band at a local VFW hall that her and her husband took George to see, or they were just going out there to hang out, and there was a band called the Four Vests or the Vests, and George actually got up on stage and played a few songs with them, apparently. So that's the other thing. A lot of this stuff is I don't really have any reason to doubt her, but some of the claims and stories in the book, I don't know, kind of taking them with a grain of salt, I guess. But so the Four Vests were playing here at the VFW, and people were not really applauding or just kind of politely applauding and not paying that much attention to them. But at one point, Kenny, one of the guys in the vests, came over and asked her if she thought George would get up and do a song or two with him because he had heard that George played guitar. And she said probably he's on vacation, doesn't want to mess with that, but if you put a guitar in his hands, I don't think he could resist. There's another exclamation point that's throughout the whole book. So anyway, Kenny comes over to George and says, "Hey, can you take over for me for a few minutes because I have to go do something." George gets on stage and plays three or four songs, and whereas the Vests had been getting a polite or subdued response from the audience there in the VFW hall, when George started playing, well, George stepped to the mic and began to sing. Almost immediately, it was as though a lightning bolt had ripped through the room. The chatter stopped, and everybody started to yell, applaud, stomp their feet on the ground, pound their fists on the table, fingers in their mouth as they gave super loud whistles. Some of the songs included Teddy Bear, Green Onions, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. The room full of people continued to go wild, and when he stepped down from the stage, George was mobbed. Yeah, maybe that happened, but I don't know. So, is this book worth it? If you're a huge Beatle fan, you're probably going to want it. If you're a casual Beatle fan, probably there's a lot better books out there. I wouldn't worry about picking this one up unless you find it for $1 or something in a used bookstore, and even then, maybe not. If you're a huge Beatle fan, like I said, you're probably going to want to read it. You're probably going to be uh, slightly disappointed, at least. Uh, a few good stories, uh, just a scant bit of new information, and a lot of detours into totally unrelated topics that mean I'm sure Louise Harrison is a nice lady, nothing against her, but the only reason that anybody in the world at large is interested in her is because she's George Harrison's sister, and not so much for who she is in her own life there, which sounds kind of rude, but there it is. Scale of 1 to 10. It does have some nice pictures, I guess. I will give the book a 4. And there are some pictures in here that I had not seen before, so that's kind of a neat thing. And I think a 4 is about right. Uh, there, by the way, is the Four Vests. And according to Louise Harrison, they asked him to become a member, and so George could have, instead of being a Beatle, he could have traded that band and gone to fame and fortune as the fifth best, I guess. And it even says in there that George could have been the fifth best. It's got an exclamation point. 4 out of 1 to 10. Hardcore Beatle fans, maybe. Everybody else, it's a skip. Have a good night, everybody.